which isn't talked about much, is his own origins. He came from a Jewish family. And of course, he was living in a world where you had to cover this up and you had to constantly go and plead to be given a certificate saying that you were pure, that you came from an old Christian family, and people were spending a lot of money bribing to get these certificates. And his family managed to get him one, so he could, not be discriminated against. But they refused to let him go to the New World because the rule was that the New World was only for pure old Christians. We don't want to let the Moriscos or the Marranos, Jews and Muslims, Spanish Jews and Muslims go, because who knows, they might revive what we have taken away from them here in the New World, and that would not be good. And so he was asked 3 times to go to the New World, Cervantes, and it was denied. So it's obvious. And then also in the opening chapter, he gives a hint in a very sweet way about his own origins. He says, of course, in the same bazaar in Toledo, you will find not just Arabic manuscripts, but manuscripts for a language that is even older and more noble, i.e. Hebrew. So here he's giving a very open hint of who he is and what he is, even though he lives in a world where this has to be denied. And all the contradictions of living in a world where you have to mask your identity are on display in the book. And finally, in part 2 of the book, there is an old Spanish Muslim, Ricote, a shopkeeper, who comes back to his village, and he's from the same village as Sancho Panza. And Sancho Panza sees him, and he's come back from where? From Germany, where the Lutherans have given him refuge. Now, if you don't know the history of this, then it's difficult to appreciate why Cervantes has put this in. The Lutherans are giving them refuge against the Roman Catholic Church because many of the Protestants who were persecuted by the Church were given refuge in Istanbul by the Ottoman empires, as were many Jews who had to leave Spain. That's where they were given refuge. So Cervantes is doing a double number here, saying that this Muslim shopkeeper from this village, he wasn't in the Maghreb, in Algiers or Morocco. No, he was living in Germany. And he's come back. And why has he come back? Because he's come back because he hid some valuables, and he's come back to collect them for his children. And the conversation between Sancho Panza and Ricote is one of the most moving accounts of what happens when people are expelled or ethnically cleansed or driven out. It is a really incredibly moving exchange. And this is, a lot of the novel is about that. And it's a big assault on religious dogma. He doesn't attack the Catholic Church by name because he would have been killed. I mean, lots of people have been killed for doing less than that. But the whole thrust of Cervantes is in the novel. And then you take the traces of all this that are left in Europe. 300 years later, after Cervantes, an Irish writer living in cramped conditions in Trieste is writing. Who is he? He's James Joyce. What is he thinking? What is he writing? He's thinking about the tortured history of his country, which he believes has been wrecked by the church and priests. He's thinking about his continent, and he's thinking about his religion. And he's writing Ulysses. And at one point, he's writing Ulysses, and his hero, Stephen Daedalus, is teaching a bunch of school kids in a school in Dublin. And suddenly, Joyce shifts the entire focus of what he's writing between the teacher and the kids, because the teacher has suddenly, he's got bored with the kids who aren't listening to him anyway, and the teacher is looking at the blackboard where there are all the symbols of algebra, or algebra, as the Arabic mathematicians who invented it called it. And Joyce understands immediately, because he knows enough of history, he's a cultured man, he sees the symbols and he describes these algebraic symbols wearing quaint caps of squares and cubes. And then suddenly he pays homage to that culture and civilization that produced algebra. And he refers to these symbols of algebra as imps of the fancy of the Moors. The Moors was the reference to Spanish, Arabs. Moors, gone too from this world, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Moses Maimonides, Ibn Maimon, the Jewish philosopher. And then Joyce carries on and writes, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness which brightness could not understand. And this is one of the warmest literary tributes paid by a modern novelist, I think, a modern European novelist, to that culture. Now, just to return to Saladin, there's one very interesting fable about him. This is a Spanish fable. It's called the Libro del Conde Lucanor. In this, it's a very interesting fable because it reflects on many things. In this fable, Saladin falls in love with the wife of one of his officers. He doesn't know what to do, and the wife of the officer, he says to her, I want you, and she says, okay, I'll sleep with you if you answer one question. This is a 12th century fable. Who could write this now? We'd all be fatwa. So she says, I'll sleep with you if you provide the answer to one question. And he says, of course I'll answer it. And she says, if you can answer it and your answer is correct, then we will become lovers. And she says to him, what is the best thing that a man can have within himself? Which thing is the mother and chief of all excellences? Saladin says, I don't know. And she says, well, okay, if you don't know, then tough. So he says, no, but leave me alone and I'm going to find out. So according to this fable, Saladin hops on a ship and comes to Europe, goes to see the Pope, and says, Papa, what is the best thing a man can have within himself? And the Pope says, I don't know. Then he goes to see the King of France, and the King of France says, look, I understand your problem, but I cannot give you an answer. I cannot give you an answer. So finally he's distraught and is coming back, and he's coming back on the way home. And he suddenly sees an old man, poor old man, not quite a beggar, but a malang, as we say in the Punjab, you know, bohemian. And he's standing on the road with a beard, and Saladin says, everyone else has failed me. Why don't I ask this guy? So he says, old man, I'm Saladin, I've come a long way. And he poses the question to him again. What is the best thing that a man can have within himself? Which thing is the mother and chief of all excellences? And the old man looks carefully and he says, the answer to the question that woman put to you is very simple. The thing is shame. And because of shame, man desists from doing all the things that do not seem right to him, no matter how great his desire. So according to this fable, Saladin goes back. Saladin goes back, tells the woman, this is the answer you wanted. She said yes, and he renounces her, says, I'm sorry. But then, because it's a Spanish fable written by a spiritual Catholic, he says, and after this, the great King Saladin